Hi everyone, it's me, Tim. Today I want to talk about my game asset preservation. If you remember a few months ago, I did a video on game preservation. I'll link it below. And in that video, I talked a lot about how companies have lost things. And kind of sounded mad about it, and in a way I am, mainly because if you take the authority to keep these things and tell other people not to, and they have no right to, then you also have to take the responsibility to keep them. And it just kind of makes me mad when repeatedly companies, and especially people high up at companies, take authority but not responsibility. That's a whole other video. I want to talk about how I've tried preserving things. But despite that, and despite my best efforts, and I think my efforts have been pretty good, I've lost stuff too. I've lost a lot of stuff. And that's kind of what I want to talk about what I've lost and why it was so hard to preserve things. So I'm going to go through some of my games. If you don't know what I'm talking about, you might want to watch the career video I have. I'll link it below because I walk through all the companies I worked at and all the games I worked at each company. And that gets far more details than I'll give here. But I can break down some of my preservation effort into groupings. So let's talk about source code. I have all the source code for all the Troika games because we, in the sense in Arcanum and Temple, we own it. We can't give it out. I've already talked about that. I don't own it for the sense of being able to put it out as open source, but I owned it in terms of this is my code. I can reuse it in other games if I want. And the two publishers, in this case Sierra and Atari, they owned it only for use in that one game, not even a remake. So I thought it was my job to preserve the code, and I have. I also preserved Vampire's code just because I did work on it for the last year and a half, primarily doing programming. So I had an image of it, and so I tucked it away, and Troika closed shortly thereafter. However, the first 3 games in my career, I don't have any of the source code for those at all, and for different reasons. The very first game I made was Grand Slam Bridge. I made that when I was a teenager. I started working at a company when I was 16. Actually, the day I turned 16. And I worked on Grand Slam Bridge in my late teens and very, very, very early 20s. I didn't have a PC at home. So all of my work was there at the company. It was Pegasus Software, and they changed their name to Cybron. I never had the code, personal copy, and so I don't know what happened when that company went out of business. Similarly, when I did my next game, Bard's Tale Construction Set, I was a contractor, and I had to deliver the source code as part of the contract, and I did keep a copy for archival purposes. And my second game, Rags to Riches, which I made while I was my first game for Interplay as an employee, I also kept a copy. These were on, I had a PC at home, and these were on the hard drive. That hard drive died on me in, I want to say, 93, 94, and I lost a lot of stuff. And you may go, why didn't you have it backed up? Well, that machine was so old, I think I bought it in 91 or 92. It didn't have a CD-ROM drive on it, a writable one. There was nothing to back up to. I could have backed up to floppies, but the hard drive was so much faster and floppies were so small. Hard drives got a lot bigger faster than floppies didn't keep up with it. Compression stuff was also licensed. Like you had to buy a copy of a compression, like PKZip or something. I could have written one. I should have written one. I didn't. Code was lost. The Fallout stuff I've talked about. They told me to destroy it. I did. People said, why didn't you keep a copy of it? When you're being threatened with a lawsuit, you delete it all. I did keep all the stuff in Troika. Great, talked about that. Carbine, I did some code there while I was programming director, mainly some AI code and some sound code. But then when I switched over to being the design director, it didn't occur to me to make a backup. And then when I left, I didn't take anything with me. So any code I did at Carbine, that's gone. And then when you get to Obsidian, that's interesting. I don't have any of my Obsidian code. And for completely different reasons. One, Obsidian is really good about backing stuff up. When a game ends, they do a backup and archive of all the stuff. So I'm like, well, they have it. So in my head, I was like, well, what's the point of me keeping a copy of this? They're archiving it. And I think they are, and I think they're doing a good job. So that's all. That's the state of like source code of my games. Art, very different. I'm talking source art, not what ships with the game. I'm talking about, take Fallout. Even though it shipped with sprites, it was a sprite-based engine, they were all made in 3D. They were made as models in Maya or Alias. I always get confused. We used Maya for one of them and Alias for Arcanum, and or vice versa. Anyway, that source art files were huge. Keeping a copy of them on your hard drive, the non-artist didn't do it. The artist had bigger hard drives. They were backed up to DAT tape, but I don't know what happened to that DAT tape, and it doesn't last that long. They last 5 or 10 years before they start having errors. So I think that source art is all gone. And I've talked about the clay heads. The clay heads went into storage when Interplay. Most of them went into storage. 1 or 2 of them were displayed in the lobby. I don't know what happened to any of that when Interplay went bankrupt. I don't know anybody who has the heads. Nobody's even secretly come to me and said, I've got the heads. A few people have come to me and said, hey, you know that source code you don't have? I got it. And I'm like, keep it. The irony was who had the source code. Sometimes it wasn't even a programmer. They just said, I liked, one person said, I like looking at code. Okay. Let's jump to other things like design work. You would think that would be the easiest to keep. But the early stuff was lost, mainly because either it was physical and I moved and moved and moved. I went to school, moved across the country, different state. I just lost stuff. But the later stuff was digital in my career, but it also was large and hard to back up. Think about Confluence. A lot of the design documents in the later part of my career was done on Confluence, and making a local copy of that, yeah, you could dump it out, but all the links break, and there's maybe the art doesn't go on. People have embedded videos, and it's large and difficult to back up. So it's not. Oddly, the thing I have the most backup of throughout my career were production notes. Things like meeting notes I took, either the agenda I wrote down of the topics I wanted to cover beforehand, or me writing up what happened in the meeting afterwards, because I told you I often kept notes like that, especially at the end of the day, and I did it when I went home. So it was on paper, it was at home, it's nothing that got destroyed. Other things were things like rough drafts of production schedules, events that were happening, like this demo's coming up, or GDC's coming up, or CES or E3 conferences and conventions were coming up. Because these were kept on paper, some of them are lost, but a lot of them I did find later on. They were in a box in my garage, and they survived. Which brings me to my next thing, which is physical digital backups. And by that I mean physical backups of digital data like disks or DAT tape. It deteriorates. It falls apart. I bought my first digital camera in 2003 when I went on the Temple of Elemental Evil press tour in London. Took a ton of pictures. I backed them up because I really, really wanted to make sure I had them. I had a burnable CD writer on my computer, and I burned them to CD. That was in 2003. Less than 10 years later, I think it was about 2010, 2011, I went to look at that CD, and about 5-10% of the photos were corrupted. They weren't. I verified the right after I did it. They had just, though, the CD had started to deteriorate, even though I kept it in a temperature and humidity controlled space. So it's very difficult to keep physical backups. My physical notes on paper fared, ironically, way better than some of the discs and CDs that I had. Cloud storage is something that I've started using more recently, where I use a cloud system to mirror a second hard drive. I bought a very large second hard drive on my machine, and it's mirrored to the cloud. So anything that gets written to the hard drive immediately goes up in the cloud. Anything that I save to the cloud, if I see something on a web page and save it into the cloud, see something on my phone and save it into the cloud, it immediately gets written to the hard drive. The nice thing about this is, on the odd chance that cloud storage gets corrupted, and I know they use RAID disks, or that cloud storage goes out of business, I have my hard drive. my hard drive explodes, I got the cloud. The chance of both of those events happening at the same time is pretty small, so I'm very happy with my cloud storage. Quick side note, I tried keeping physical things all my life. I kept old consoles, I kept old handhelds, I even kept my old computer, my Atari 800. But guess what? Time is not kind to those things, especially if they're not stored carefully. If you don't store them in temperature and humidity controlled places, they deteriorate. I kept those things in a garage, and my Atari 800 eventually stopped working. The disk drive stopped working after just, I'm going to say 6 or 7 years of storage like that. It just didn't work anymore. I had an Atari Lynx. I bought a second one so I'd have backup parts. They broke. Basically what happens is they age badly, especially when they're used. They heat up and then cool down and heat up and cool down and heat up and cool down. The plastic gets very brittle, and then you store it and it just eventually breaks. They also take up a ton of space. You guys have seen all the stuff I have here. I've done videos on the cabinet and I've done video on the shelves. This is about half of what I have. The other half is still boxed. And all of that is only about 10% of what I had before moving a few times. And then just going, I just can't have all this stuff. And I gave away a lot of stuff. And I threw away some stuff. And some of you would cry if you knew what I threw away. But I just couldn't keep it. Eventually you just gotta let go. It's kind of zen. Probably should do a video on stuff I learned about making games and just life in general from Zen Buddhism. But anyway, what I'm trying to say here is all of as much as I can, I've tried to store all my physical notes. I've converted them to digital and put them up in the cloud, because that right now is my current way of thinking. This is how this stuff will get preserved. Now, with the state of copyright, that's the best I can do. I can't give you guys a lot of these things. However, I did write a memoir, and not only is that PDF stored in the cloud, but I gave that PDF to a friend of mine, just in case. I'm getting older, something happens, she has a copy of it, who knows. But this is the best I can do, and I've lost stuff, and I think I take an active effort to try to keep a lot of things, so I can see why companies have lost stuff. However, they had the responsibility to do it, and that, I think, is the difference. I think more companies need to step up and take that responsibility more seriously if they're going to claim the sole authority. And that's everything I can think of in terms of my own personal attempts and thoughts on game asset preservation.